It was 11:42 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday when the suffocating silence of the 50-room estate was finally broken. Victoria, a woman who ruthlessly controlled a $40 billion corporate empire, froze at her mahogany desk. It wasn't the sound of an intruder, nor the shrill ring of a late-night crisis line. It was a sound she hadn't heard in exactly 2 years, 4 months, and 16 days. A child's laughter. Her daughter's laughter. Trembling, Victoria brought up the estate's high-definition security feed, expecting a cruel trick of the mind. Instead, the glowing screen revealed a truth so terrifying and profound, it would shatter her perfectly constructed world entirely. The Kensington estate sat on 400 acres of pristine, heavily guarded land in upstate New York. From the outside, it was a masterpiece of modern architecture, a sprawling fortress of glass, steel, and imported Italian marble. But inside, it was a tomb. Victoria Kensington, the billionaire CEO of Kensington Logistics, had built this fortress to keep the world out. At 38, she was a titan of industry, known in boardrooms from Wall Street to Tokyo as a woman made of ice. She negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without blinking and dismantled rival companies with surgical precision. But her ruthless exterior was a carefully constructed armor, forged in the fires of an unimaginable tragedy. 2 years ago, a catastrophic car accident on Interstate 95 had torn Victoria's life apart. Her husband, Jonathan, a brilliant architect with a laugh that could warm the coldest room, was killed instantly when a commercial freight truck lost control in a torrential downpour and crushed their SUV. In the back seat was their 5-year-old daughter, Lily. Lily survived the physical impact with minor injuries, but the psychological trauma was absolute. The bright, bubbly girl who used to sing at the top of her lungs and chase butterflies through the gardens had vanished in the wreckage. Since the night of the crash, Lily had not spoken a single word. She had not cried. She had not laughed. She became a ghost haunting her own home, communicating only through empty stares and slight nods. Victoria poured millions into helping her daughter. She hired the world's top pediatric neurologists, renowned trauma therapists, and holistic healers. She turned a wing of the mansion into a state-of-the-art sensory therapy center. Nothing worked. The doctors spoke of profound PTSD and dissociative mutism, offering clinical excuses for a mother's greatest failure. Consumed by grief and a silent, festering guilt for not being in the car with them that night, Victoria retreated into her work. If she couldn't fix her daughter, she would conquer the world instead. She became an absentee mother, providing everything financially, but incapable of facing the hollowed-out shell of her child emotionally. The day-to-day care of Lily fell to a rotating army of elite nannies, tutors, and staff. But turnover was high. The oppressive silence of the Kensington estate was too much for most people to bear. Then came Thomas Bennett. Thomas wasn't hired to look after Lily. He was hired as the estate's new head groundskeeper. Victoria's executive assistant had handled the recruitment, noting only that Thomas was a 34-year-old single father who came with impeccable references for landscape architecture and a desperate need for on-site housing. Victoria had absent-mindedly signed the approval forms, granting Thomas and his 5-year-old son, Leo, residence in the small, stone gatehouse at the edge of the property. To Victoria, Thomas was just another background character in the theater of her isolated life. When she saw him from her office window, he was always working, a tall, broad-shouldered man with calloused hands, sun-weathered skin, and a quiet, unassuming demeanor. He was always wearing long-sleeved flannel shirts, even in the sweltering heat of summer. Often, his little boy, Leo, could be seen trailing behind him, carrying a plastic watering can or digging in the dirt. For the first 3 months, Victoria and Thomas never exchanged a single word. He kept the sprawling gardens immaculate. She kept the global supply chain running. Their worlds were separate, divided by invisible lines of wealth, class, and unspoken sorrow. But unbeknownst to Victoria, a subtle shift was happening on the grounds of the estate. While the nannies sat in the climate-controlled playrooms scrolling through their phones, Lily had started wandering outside. She would stand at the edge of the manicured lawns, watching Thomas work. Thomas never shooed her away. He never offered her the pitying, overly gentle smiles that the therapist did. He simply worked. occasionally handing Lily a bulb to drop into the soil or showing her a resting ladybug on a leaf. And there was Leo. The energetic, messy, vibrantly alive 5-year-old boy didn't understand that the billionaire's daughter was broken. To Leo, Lily was just another kid. He would run circles around her, offering her half-eaten crackers or babbling about his toy trucks. Lily never responded, but for the first time in years, she didn't walk away. Victoria knew none of this. She was too busy fighting corporate wars, insulated in her glass tower, blind to the tiny seeds of life being planted in her own backyard. She had convinced herself that the cold, silent world she had built was the only way to survive. But the walls of her fortress were about to come crashing down. It was a Tuesday night, shortly before midnight. A heavy summer thunderstorm was battering the estate, rain lashing furiously against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Victoria's home office. The storm outside mirrored the chaos on her desk. She was finalizing a hostile takeover of a European shipping conglomerate, a deal that required her ruthless, undivided attention. A half-empty glass of scotch sat next to her keyboard, catching the dim glow of her monitors. Beside her phone sat the digital security hub. It was an advanced system that monitored the entire estate, feeding high-definition video and audio from 90 different cameras directly to her desk. Usually, it was a silent stream of empty hallways and rain-soaked lawns. Victoria was in the middle of drafting a devastating legal email when she heard it. A sharp, breathy sound cutting through the static of the audio feed. Victoria's fingers froze over the keyboard. She blinked, her heart suddenly slamming against her ribs. She stared at the digital hub. The audio equalizer for camera 14 East Conservatory was bouncing wildly. She leaned in, holding her breath. The storm thundered outside, but beneath the rumble of the rain, the sound came again. It was a giggle, a bright, genuine, uncontrolled childhood giggle. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. It was impossible. She hadn't heard that sound since the morning of the accident. She reached out with trembling fingers and tapped the screen, pulling up the live feed from the East Conservatory. The conservatory was a massive, glass-domed botanical room filled with exotic flora, a place Jonathan had designed himself. On the screen, bathed in the silver, ambient light of the security cameras, Victoria saw 3 figures. It was Thomas, the groundskeeper. He was sitting cross-legged on the stone floor. Beside him was his son, Leo, in dinosaur pajamas. And sitting directly across from them, her knees pulled to her chest, was Lily. Victoria's breath hitched. What is he doing in the main house at midnight? Why is Lily out of bed? Where is the night nanny? Her initial instinct was a surge of protective, maternal rage. She reached for the button to summon her private security detail, ready to have the man arrested for trespassing. But her hand hovered in the air as she watched the scene unfold on the screen. Thomas wasn't doing anything threatening. He was holding a large industrial flashlight, pointing it at the blank, white stucco wall of the conservatory. He was making shadow puppets. But it wasn't just random shapes. Victoria leaned closer to the monitor, her eyes widening in disbelief. Thomas's hands were moving with a practiced, rhythmic grace, forming intricate, specific silhouettes. First, a bird with articulated wings. Then, a tree bending in the wind. Finally, he twisted his hands into a complex shape, moving his thumbs and pinkies in a specific, galloping motion. It was a fox. A dancing fox, Victoria gasped, covering her mouth with her hand, her vision blurred with sudden tears. The dancing fox and the moon. It was Jonathan's story. It was the deeply personal, uniquely complex shadow puppet routine her late husband had invented for Lily. He had created it when Lily was 3, perfecting the difficult hand gestures over months. He used to perform it for her every time there was a thunderstorm to keep her from being afraid. No one else knew those gestures. No one else knew the specific order of the animals. Jonathan had never written it down. It was a private ritual between a father and his daughter. On the screen, Thomas made the shadow fox leap toward the shadow moon. Leo was giggling loudly, but Victoria's eyes were locked entirely on Lily. Lily's face was illuminated by the flashlight's spill. Her large, usually vacant eyes were wide and sparkling. A massive, radiant smile stretched across her face. And then, As the shadow fox tripped and tumbled down an imaginary hill, Lily threw her head back. The microphone picked it up perfectly, a loud, bell-like, joyous laugh. Victoria broke down. A sob tore through her throat, echoing in the empty, cold office. She watched her daughter laugh again and again, the sound washing over her like a miracle. For a split second, the heavy, suffocating weight of the past 2 years lifted off her chest. Her daughter was still in there. Her little girl wasn't gone. But the miracle was immediately eclipsed by a chilling, paralyzing wave of suspicion. Victoria stared at Thomas's face on the monitor. He was smiling softly at Lily, his expression a mix of profound sadness and gentle warmth. "Who are you?" Victoria thought, the corporate shark within her instantly awakening, cold and calculating. "How do you know my dead husband's secret story?" Her mind raced through terrifying possibilities. Was Thomas a stalker? Had he been watching their family before the accident? Was he somehow involved in the crash? The groundskeeper, a man she had dismissed as a simple laborer, had just bypassed millions of dollars in medical therapies using a secret piece of her family's past. Victoria wiped her tears away, her expression hardening into stone. She didn't press the security button to have him thrown out. If she spooked him, she might never find out the truth. Worse, she might traumatize Lily all over again and lose her forever. Instead, Victoria hit the record button on the security hub, saving the footage to an encrypted server. She watched the screen until Thomas gently closed the flashlight, walked Lily back to the door of the main house, and disappeared into the rain with his son. Victoria didn't sleep that night. She sat in the dark, replaying the footage of the laughing child and the mysterious groundskeeper over and over, preparing for war. At 6 a.m. the next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the estate draped in a thick, gray fog. Victoria sat at the head of the massive dining table, nursing a cup of black coffee. She hadn't changed out of her clothes from the night before. Across the table stood Winston, her head of global security. Winston was a former intelligence officer, a man who specialized in corporate espionage, threat assessment, and making problems quietly disappear. "I need a complete, absolute teardown of this man," Victoria said, sliding a tablet across the table. The screen displayed a still image from the security footage, Thomas Bennett's face, illuminated by the flashlight. "I want everything. Birth records, financial history, phone records, internet history. I want to know everywhere he has lived, everyone he has spoken to in the last decade, and I want it in 2 hours." Winston didn't ask questions. He merely nodded, picked up the tablet, and left the room. The 2 hours that followed were the longest of Victoria's life. She paced the length of her office, looking out the window toward the gatehouse. Through the fog, she could see Thomas methodically pruning the rose bushes, his son Leo playing in the mud nearby. He looked so devastatingly ordinary, but Victoria knew better than to trust appearances. In her world, everyone had an angle. Everyone wanted a piece of the Kensington Empire. At 8:15 a.m., Winston returned. He didn't have his usual stoic composure. He looked visibly disturbed as he placed a thick, manila folder on Victoria's desk. "You were right to be suspicious, Miss Kensington," Winston said quietly. "The man working in your garden is not a groundskeeper, and his name is not Thomas Bennett." Victoria snatched the folder, flipping it open. "Who is he?" "His legal name is Thomas Holden," Winston explained. "Bennett is his late mother's maiden name. He used it to pass the preliminary background checks, which, frankly, were far too lax for a perimeter staff hire. I'll be having a word with HR." "Skip the HR report, Winston. Tell me about Holden." 5 years ago, Winston said, pointing to a document in the file, Thomas Holden was one of the top pediatric trauma surgeons at St. Jude's. He was a prodigy. Board certified, highly decorated. Victoria stared at the photograph attached to the medical license. It was a younger, clean-shaven Thomas, wearing scrubs, smiling confidently. A pediatric trauma surgeon? "What is a surgeon doing planting tulips in my yard?" "He lost his medical license 2 years ago," Winston said, his voice lowering. "Miss Kensington, he lost it exactly 2 years, 4 months, and 16 days ago." Victoria's blood ran cold. The date of the accident. She looked up at Winston, dread pooling in her stomach. "Tell me." "The night of the crash on Interstate 95, Winston began, his tone careful and measured. Dr. Holden was driving home from a double shift. He had his wife, Sarah, in the passenger seat. She was pregnant with their second child. They were directly behind your husband's SUV when the freight truck lost control. Victoria felt the air leave her lungs. She gripped the edge of the desk. Holden wasn't just a witness, Winston continued. When the vehicles collided, your husband's SUV rolled over the guardrail and caught fire. Holden stopped his car. He told his wife to stay put and call 911, and he ran into the wreckage. Winston reached into the folder and pulled out a series of redacted police reports and fire department logs. The official narrative you were given by our legal team was that the emergency responders arrived in time to pull Lily out, but it was too late for Jonathan. That was a lie fabricated by Kensington Logistics' crisis PR team to limit corporate liability, because the freight truck that caused the accident was secretly operated by one of our subsidiary shell companies. Victoria felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Her company had caused the crash. Her own lawyers had lied to her. The truth, Victoria, Winston said gently, using her first name for the first time, is that the fire trucks were delayed by the storm. Dr. Holden was the only one there. The SUV's doors were jammed. Holden shattered the back window with his bare hands. He crawled into the burning vehicle. He found Lily pinned under the seat. It took him 4 minutes to free her. During that time, he suffered third-degree burns up both of his arms. Victoria gasped, suddenly remembering the long-sleeved flannel shirts Thomas wore in the sweltering heat. He was hiding the burn scars. He pulled Lily out and carried her to the grassy shoulder, Winston said. He performed emergency triage, stabilizing her spine. As he was doing that, he was talking to her to keep her conscious. He saw her crying in terror of the storm and the fire. The police report notes that a witness saw Holden doing hand puppets against the side of an ambulance to distract the little girl while they waited for the paramedics to arrive. He must have seen your husband doing them for Lily in the car before the crash. Tears were streaming freely down Victoria's face now. This man, this stranger, had walked into a raging inferno to save her daughter. He had been the one to keep her alive. Why didn't I know this? Victoria choked out, slamming her fist on the desk. Why wasn't he given a medal? Why is he pulling weeds for minimum wage? Winston's face tightened with genuine regret. Because of what happened next. While Holden was saving Lily, a drunk driver, blinded by the rain and the smoke, plowed through the police barricades. The driver smashed directly into Holden's parked car. The room fell dead silent. Victoria stopped breathing. His wife, Sarah, was killed instantly, Winston said softly. The baby didn't survive either. Holden lost everything while he was pulling your daughter from the fire. Victoria collapsed back into her leather chair, her hands covering her face. A wail of pure agony and horror tore through her lips. The injustice of it was so monstrous, so deeply cruel, she felt like the floor was giving way beneath her. And Kensington Industries, Victoria whispered through her tears. What did we do? Our lawyers saw a liability nightmare, Winston admitted, looking ashamed. If the public found out an off-duty hero lost his pregnant wife because our subsidiary's truck caused a pileup, the settlement would have bankrupted the logistics wing. So, our legal team quietly pressured the medical board. They framed the narrative. They claimed Holden acted recklessly at the scene, improperly moving victims and interfering with the EMTs. They buried him in litigation. They revoked his license. They ruined his life to protect the company's stock price. Victoria looked at the monitor. The live feed showed Thomas in the garden. He was laughing as his son Leo sprayed him with a garden hose. This man had sacrificed his wife, his unborn child, his career, and his reputation to save Lily, and Victoria's empire had rewarded him by grinding him into dust. He's not here to garden, Winston said, drawing his weapon slightly from his holster, a reflex of his profession. He bypassed our background checks. He embedded himself in your home. A man with nothing left to lose, who was destroyed by your company. Miss Kensington, he is here for revenge. I need to detain him immediately. No! Victoria shouted, leaping to her feet. Don't you dare touch him! She looked back at the screen. She remembered the gentle way he had looked at Lily the night before. He hadn't broken into the conservatory to harm her. He had broken in to make her laugh. He wasn't a threat. He was a broken angel, checking on the only life he had managed to save on the worst night of his existence. Victoria bypassed Winston, marching toward the heavy oak doors of her office. The Ice Queen was dead. The mother and the woman who owed a debt of blood and life had awakened. "Where are you going?" Winston asked, alarmed. "To tear down my own company," Victoria said, her eyes blazing with a fierce, terrifying resolve, "and to beg for forgiveness." The heavy oak doors of the Kensington estate swung open, and Victoria stepped out into the biting morning chill. She was still wearing her tailored charcoal trousers and silk blouse from the night before. Her bare feet slipped hastily into a pair of rain boots. The fog was thick, curling around the marble statues and manicured hedges like smoke. She walked with a desperate, frantic energy, her boots sinking into the wet mud. Across the expansive south lawn, she saw him. Thomas was kneeling in the dirt, meticulously tying a young, storm-battered oak sapling to a wooden stake. A few yards away, little Leo was sitting on a plastic bucket, humming to himself as he dug a trench with a yellow plastic shovel. As Victoria approached, the crunch of her boots on the gravel path alerted him. Thomas stood up, wiping his soil-stained hands on his denim jeans. His posture stiffened. He saw the red, swollen rings around Victoria's eyes and the fierce, unreadable expression on her face. He instantly knew she had seen the footage. "Leo," Thomas said, his voice low and remarkably calm, "go inside the gatehouse and wash your hands. I'll be right there." The 5-year-old boy looked up, offered Victoria a gap-toothed smile, and trotted off toward the stone cottage. Thomas turned back to Victoria, his jaw set. He didn't offer apologies or excuses. He looked like a man standing before a firing squad, ready to accept his fate. "Miss Kensington," he began, his voice steady, "I know why you're out here. I shouldn't have been in the main house last night. I crossed a boundary. I'll pack our things immediately." Victoria stopped 10 feet away from him. Her chest heaved. She looked at this broad-shouldered, quiet man, a man she had treated like invisible machinery, and she saw the phantom scars beneath his flannel sleeves. "Dr. Thomas Holden," Victoria whispered, the name tearing at her throat. Thomas froze. The color drained entirely from his face. The calm facade shattered, replaced by a look of profound, hunted panic. His eyes darted toward the gatehouse where his son had just disappeared, as if calculating how fast he could grab him and run. "How do you?" Thomas started, stepping backward. Victoria couldn't hold it in anymore. Her knees buckled. The billionaire CEO, the Ice Queen of Wall Street, collapsed into the wet grass, sobbing. "I didn't know," Victoria wept, pressing her hands over her face. The rain began to drizzle again, mixing with her tears. "I swear to God, Thomas. I swear on my daughter's life, I didn't know." Thomas stared down at her, utterly bewildered. He took a hesitant step forward. "You didn't know what?" Victoria forced herself to look up at him. "I didn't know you were the one who pulled Lily from the fire. My lawyers, they told me the paramedics got there in time. They told me Jonathan died on impact. They never told me a surgeon burned his own arms to save my little girl. They never told me your name." Thomas's expression darkened, a profound, agonizing sorrow settling over his features. He looked away, staring into the gray fog. "They did more than erase my name, Miss Kensington. They erased my life. When the medical board came after me, your legal team supplied the testimonies. They said I was negligent. They said my reckless extraction was the reason Lily stopped speaking. For 2 years, I haven't just mourned my wife. I've lived with the sickening guilt that I broke your daughter's mind because I didn't wait for the fire department." Victoria felt a physical pain in her chest, sharp and suffocating. "You didn't break her, Thomas. You kept her alive. The shadow puppets, the dancing fox." "You learned that from Jonathan, didn't you?" Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I saw him doing it in the car, right before the truck hit, and when I had Lily on the side of the road, she was screaming. The car was burning, the storm was raging. I needed to check her pupillary response, but she was thrashing. So I made the fox against the side of the ambulance. It was the only thing that calmed her down. When I saw the job posting for this estate, I didn't come for revenge. I just needed to see if she was okay. She was the only life I managed to save that night. When I saw her walking around like a ghost, I had to try." "You succeeded," Victoria choked out. she laughed. Thomas. For the first time in 2 years, you brought her back. A heavy silence fell between them, filled only by the sound of the falling rain. But Victoria wasn't finished. The hardest part was yet to come. She stood up, wiping the mud from her knees, her posture straightening as the ruthless executive within her took over, channeling her grief into a terrifying focus. Thomas, she said, her voice dropping to a trembling whisper, there is something else I didn't know until an hour ago, and I need you to listen to me very carefully. Thomas frowned, sensing the shift in the air. The freight truck that lost control on Interstate 95? Victoria said, looking directly into his eyes. The one that crushed my husband's SUV and set off the chain reaction that killed Sarah? It belonged to a logistics shell company. Thomas stopped breathing. He stared at her, his mind struggling to connect the dots. A shell company. Owned by Kensington Logistics, Victoria confessed, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. My company caused the crash. My lawyers knew our driver was overworked and the truck's brakes failed inspection. They knew if your story came out, the hero doctor who lost his pregnant wife because of our negligence, the public backlash and the lawsuits would destroy the stock. So they buried the truth. They buried you to protect me. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas took a stumbling step back. His eyes widened as the horrific reality washed over him. The woman paying his meager salary, the estate he was currently standing on, was funded by the empire that had slaughtered his family and stolen his career. You! Thomas gasped, his voice cracking with a sudden, ferocious rage, his hands balled into fists. Your company! Killed Sarah? Yes, Victoria said, not breaking eye contact, refusing to hide from his fury. She deserved it. My people lied to me, but it is my company, my responsibility, my sin. Thomas turned away, pacing violently. He grabbed the wooden stake he had just planted and yanked it out of the ground with a savage, guttural yell, hurling it into the fog. He fell to his knees in the mud, gasping for air as 2 years of suppressed agony clawed its way out of his throat. Victoria didn't approach him. She let him rage. She let him grieve. When Thomas finally looked back at her, his eyes were hollow. Why are you telling me this? Why not just fire me and let me rot? You could have kept the secret forever. Because hiding behind walls is what destroyed us both, Victoria said fiercely. I am going to Manhattan today. I am going to burn my own company to the ground. I am going to put my own board of directors in federal prison. But I cannot leave Lily alone. Not anymore. She walked up to him, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a heavy set of brass keys. She held them out to him. These are the keys to the main house, Victoria said. Move your things out of the gatehouse today. Take the east wing. You and Leo belong in this home. I am going to fix what my empire broke, Doctor. Holden, I promise you that. Please, just watch over my little girl until I get back. Thomas looked at the keys, then up at Victoria. He saw the cold, unyielding fire in her eyes. It wasn't pity, it was a declaration of war. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he took the keys. The boardroom on the 40th floor of Kensington Tower was a masterpiece of intimidation. A 40-foot table cut from a single slab of black walnut dominated the space, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. At 9 a.m. on Monday, the executive board of Kensington Logistics was assembled. There was David, the chief operating officer, tapping his gold pen impatiently. Next to him sat Harrison, the general counsel, a man whose tailored suits and slicked-back hair hid a conscience completely devoid of morality. The heavy glass doors slid open, and Victoria walked in. She was flanked by Winston, her head of security, who silently locked the doors behind her and stood guard. The room quieted. Victoria didn't sit down. She walked to the head of the table, her face a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. "Good morning, Victoria," Harrison said smoothly, opening a leather binder. "We have the Q3 projections ready, and I'd like to discuss the European shipping merger." "Shut up, Harrison," Victoria said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. Harrison blinked, a smug smile faltering on his lips. "Excuse me?" Victoria picked up a remote control and pressed a button. The massive screen at the end of the boardroom flickered to life. Instead of quarterly projections, the screen displayed a blown-up, high-resolution photograph of the burning wreckage on Interstate 95. Next to it was the medical license of Dr. Thomas Holden, stamped with a giant red "Revoked." The blood drained from Harrison's face. David dropped his gold pen. The entire board sat in stunned, panicked silence. 2 years ago, Victoria began, her voice echoing off the glass walls. A subsidiary freight truck bypassed federal safety regulations, lost control, and killed my husband. A pediatric surgeon named Thomas Holden walked into the fire to save my daughter. In return, this board, led by our general counsel, orchestrated a massive, illegal cover-up to protect our stock price. You destroyed an innocent man, suppressed evidence of corporate manslaughter, and lied to your CEO. Harrison stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Victoria, you are distressed. You don't know what you're talking about. This is a severe breach of protocol. Sit down, Winston barked from the door, his hand resting casually on his hip near his sidearm. Harrison swallowed hard and slowly sank back into his chair. You thought because I was grieving, because I checked out, that you could run my empire like a cartel, Victoria continued, leaning over the table, her eyes locking onto Harrison's terrified gaze. You calculated that the life of my husband, the mind of my daughter, and the family of Dr. Holden were acceptable collateral damage for a clean balance sheet. Victoria, listen to reason, David pleaded, sweating profusely. If this information leaves this room, the stock will plummet. The company will be subjected to federal investigations. It will ruin Kensington Logistics. It will ruin you. Victoria smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile. David, you underestimate me, Victoria said softly. I don't care about the stock. She pressed another button on the remote. The screen shifted to display a series of digital email receipts. 30 minutes ago, Victoria announced, Winston and I dumped the entire encrypted server of the legal department, including Harrison's private, off-the-books communications regarding the crash directly to the Department of Justice, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the editorial desk of the New York Times. Chaos erupted. Several board members jumped to their feet, shouting in panic. Harrison lunged for his cell phone, but Winston was already stepping forward, shaking his head. The building is currently locked down, Victoria said over the noise, her voice ringing with absolute authority. The FBI is in the lobby. They have warrants for corporate fraud, witness tampering, and manslaughter. You are not leaving this room, except in handcuffs. And Harrison looked at Victoria with pure venom. You've destroyed your own legacy. You've burned your own house down. No, Harrison, Victoria replied, turning her back on him as the sound of sirens began to wail faintly from the streets below. I'm just clearing the wreckage. 6 months later, the Kensington estate was unrecognizable. The heavy, suffocating silence had been thoroughly banished. The heavy velvet curtains were pulled back, letting sunlight stream across the Italian marble floors. The pristine, untouched lawns were now littered with brightly colored plastic trucks, soccer balls, and muddy footprints. Victoria sat on a stone bench in the East Conservatory. She wore a simple, comfortable sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She was reading a novel, sipping tea, and occasionally looking up to watch the chaos unfolding in the center of the room. Kensington Logistics had survived the purge, though barely. Victoria had stepped down as CEO, taking a backseat role as chairman while the company restructured entirely. She had liquidated a massive portion of her own shares, using the billions to create the Jonathan Kensington and Sarah Holden Foundation for Pediatric Trauma. And its chief medical director was none other than Dr. Thomas Holden, whose medical license had been fully, publicly, and apologetically reinstated by the state board. Gotcha! A voice yelled. Leo, now covered in dirt, sprinted past Victoria's bench, clutching a stolen stuffed rabbit. A moment later, small, rapid footsteps followed him. Leo, give it back! Victoria lowered her book, a soft, involuntary smile touching her lips. It was Lily. She was running, her cheeks flushed with life, her eyes bright and focused. Her voice was still slightly raspy from disuse, but it grew stronger every day. Thomas walked into the conservatory holding 2 juice boxes. He was wearing a casual button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up, revealing the burn scars on his forearms. He didn't hide them anymore. They were badges of honor, proof that he had walked through the fire and survived. He handed a juice box to Victoria and sat down beside her on the bench. They sat in comfortable, easy silence, watching their children play. There was no rushed romance between them. The wounds they both carried were too deep for fairy tales. But there was a profound, unbreakable bond. They were two survivors who had pulled each other out of the wreckage of their lives to build a new family. "She read a whole page of her book aloud this morning," Thomas said softly, his eyes tracking Lily as she finally tackled Leo to the ground, giggling hysterically as she reclaimed her rabbit. "Her therapist said she's light years ahead of where they expected," Victoria replied, looking at Thomas with deep gratitude. "But she still asks for the shadow puppets when it rains." Thomas chuckled, a rich, warm sound. "I'm running out of animals, Victoria. I had to invent a dancing hippopotamus last night. It looked mostly like a potato." Victoria laughed, resting her head gently against the cold stone wall behind the bench, feeling the sunlight warm her face. Lily suddenly stopped wrestling with Leo. She looked over at the bench, her bright eyes fixing on Thomas. She scrambled to her feet and ran over, grabbing his calloused, scarred hand. "Thomas!" Lily demanded, her voice clear and ringing with the beautiful, demanding tone of a happy 5-year-old. "Do the fox again." Thomas looked at Victoria, who nodded, her eyes shining with tears she no longer needed to hide. He turned back to Lily, raising his hands, his thumbs and pinkies sliding perfectly into place. The ice had melted. The ghost was gone. The fortress was finally a home. What an incredible emotional journey. Victoria's story shows us that sometimes the most profound acts of heroism happen in the shadows, and the only way to heal a broken heart is to tear down the walls we build around ourselves. Would you have had the courage to destroy your own empire to do the right thing, just like Victoria did? If this powerful story of a father's sacrifice, a mother's fierce redemption, and the unbreakable resilience of children touched your heart, please hit that like button and share this video to help spread the message. Subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on these incredible, true-to-life dramas. We want to hear from you. What was the most shocking twist in this story for you? Was it the revelation of the shadow puppets or the moment Victoria locked the board of directors in the room? Drop a comment below and join the discussion.